All right, good morning. I'm Lyle Jepson, the Executive Director of the Chamber of Economic Development, and that is a kick me sign on my back that said don't ever do this after the Super Bowl ever again. Raise your hand if you watched that whole game last night. I did. Oh my, oh my, oh my. Okay. Well, thank you very much for being here. I realized that watching the game, got to halftime, go to bed. So then my younger kids go home. They said, oh, you gotta watch this. You gotta see these people that are gonna sing and dance. And I said, okay. So I did. I kept saying, who is that? So fortunately, my children knew who they were. And every time, I didn't have to say, who is that, more than once. And they just turned to me and would tell me, that's Jay-Z, Dad, really? And I said, oh, okay. I realized that the game was... I'll get there eventually. I gotta get out way more. So I realized as I was driving through the town of Pittsburgh that the game was more than just about the players. There was a sign in Pittsburgh that said something like, good luck, Taylor Swift's boyfriend. So I had to go, I did know her. She was the one dancing in the whole game, like they did that on purpose. Well, thank you for being here. This is our first legislative breakfast. We generally have one, and then we'll have another one near the end of what we would call the legislative season or session, and we'll talk a little bit about things that happen. Today, we're honored to have our State Treasurer, Mike Pieciak, with us. He's going to speak about things that are happening right now, things that will affect our lives on a daily basis. We also will have representatives and senators, 3 of them come up and talk after Mike speaks, a little bit about very specific things that they've been working on for us, and we appreciate that. But before I do that, we do have some introductions here. If you would just raise his hand. Mike Pieciak, thank you very much for being here. Nice round of applause for our guests. And hold your applause till the end because they're almost all of them here. I think they are all here. Our senators and representatives, just raise your hand if you would, when I say your name, Tom Burdett, Representative Burdett, who's standing and getting coffee, Representative Clifford, Representative Harrison, Senator Collimore, Representative Howard, Representative Jerome, Representative McGuire, back there, Representative McCoy, oh, over here, sorry, Representative Shaw, Representative, oh, I'm sorry, Senator Williams, sorry, right here, Senator Weeks, Representative Canfield, who I will never forget again. Remember, were you here at the time that I forgot to introduce Bill? Okay, that was back when you were, who was that? Bill says he remembers. Representative Peterson, Representative Knott, and Representative Chestnut Tangeman. Thank you very much for being here. Let's give them a round of applause. They are working for us every day, every day. And when you start to introduce people, you forget people, and that's a bad thing. But there are a couple people that I do just want to call out. Actually, 3 people who have been working in what I would call a triumvirate of development, and that is up in Killington. We are very fortunate that we have a triumvirate of the resort. Mike Salamano is here. Mike, raise your hand right back here. Let's give him a round of applause, President of Killington Resort. We're also fortunate to have Selectman Jim Haff here. Where are you, Jim? Raise your hand. Let's give him a round of applause from the town of Killington. And also the president of Great Gulf Residential, who will be doing development there, which is the 3rd leg of the tri-legged stool that we were going to need to build everything in Killington, Michael Sneed. Oh, and see, Jim takes over. Does anybody know Jim? So, Michael Ramsey, the business manager town manager for Killington. Nice round of applause for Michael. And that's where I'm going to stop, because there are a lot of cool things going on in a lot of different places, but we're about to have multi-million-dollar development in Killington that is going to affect all of us. And so we are very excited about that. So, without further ado, there are note cards on your table. And if you have a question for any of the speakers, primarily Mike, please write them down and I'll come around and grab those from you. Also, on your table is a CEDRR legislative agenda. We have specific items, probably too many, about 20 on that list, that we are reaching out to our legislators about. We will have a couple of our representatives and a senator come up and talk to us a little bit after Mike. What else was I going to say? Oh, this is my advertising, sorry. The Hub Co-works, if you're interested in the Hub Co-works, please, there's a couple brochures on your table there that talks about the Hub Co-works, which is a new co-working facility within our location at 67 Merchants Road. Go on the radio, Lyle. Okay, we'll do it on the radio. But without further ado, what I would like to do is introduce Mike Pieciak. Mike, as you may know, is the 31st state treasurer. He was inaugurated in January of 23, so this is a full year into his term at this point. He has been focused on the economy and financial equity, and Mike successfully championed the passage of Vermont Saves, a publicly administered retirement program for 80,000 Vermonters who did not have a plan. Mike also expanded the 10% in Vermont program and made the development of new housing a top priority. In September 23, his office announced $55.5 million in low-interest housing loans that's expected to leverage an estimated $340 million in additional capital to support the construction of over 1,100 housing units in Vermont. Mike previously served 6 years as the commissioner of the Vermont Department of Financial Regulation, where he was first appointed by Governor Peter Shumlin in 2016 and reappointed by Phil Scott in 2017. During the pandemic, we all remember 3 people standing up and talking to us day in, day out, answering every question that people put to them, and they stayed as long as there were questions. Mike was one of those people standing there during the COVID pandemic. Mike also served as Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Financial Regulation Security Division, where he led the division's investigation into Jay Peak's EB-5 issue. Prior to public service, Mike practiced law in New York City and at Downs, Rackman and Martin in Burlington in the business law group. Mike grew up in Brattleboro and graduated cum laude from Union College with a degree in political science. He received his law degree, summa cum laude, from the University of Miami School of Law, where he served as editor-in-chief of the Miami Law Review. Mike currently resides in Winooski with his partner Will and English setter Jetty. Help me in welcoming Mike Pieciak.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to Lyle for inviting me down. One thing I definitely learned, Lyle, and I did play football at Union, so I am a football fan, that when Lyle invites you to something months in advance, you should check out what's happening the night before the 7:30 business meeting, which I didn't put together until about 3 days ago. Me either. But no, I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here, Lyle. I'll talk about it a little bit more, but I'll talk about the 10% Vermont program. But it did end up that our first investment out of that program did help Hospital Heights here in Rutland. So we have a lot more to do, I think, with Rutland and Rutland City with that program. But excited that it did have an impact here, and we'll continue to find ways to have an impact here in Rutland. So I thought maybe I'd talk a little bit about sort of how we see things from the State Treasurer's Office from an economic perspective. Talk a little bit about some of the priorities that we've had in the first year, and then happy to take any questions that folks might have as well. But from an economic standpoint, I think it's really a tale of 2 stories in some ways, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, from my perspective. Having grown up in Vermont and having grown up in Brattleboro, there were decades, and particularly the decade before the pandemic, where there was a lot of hand-wringing and concern about demographics, not to suggest that there isn't anymore, But the hand-wringing involved the fact that our state is getting older, that our workforce was getting smaller because people were retiring out of the workforce and they weren't being replaced at the same number. You know, when you have people leaving the workforce in that way, it certainly puts pressure on your state revenues. It puts pressure on all of us from an affordability standpoint. When we were thinking about how do we solve this problem, how do we solve the demographic problem, you know, there's really challenging. There weren't a lot of policy solutions that were silver bullets in trying to recruit more people to live in Vermont. I know myself, leading up to the pandemic, those sort of few years in 2019 to 2020, it really felt like, boy, you know, something really needs to change for Vermont to get on a different trajectory from an economic standpoint, from a demographic standpoint, all the way around. And the pandemic set in. As Lyle mentioned, we all were at work, you know, every day. Dr. Levine, myself, the governor. We didn't really think too much about the broader impact. We were thinking about the day-to-day impacts that were happening with COVID-19. But then when that subsided and I decided I wanted to run for treasurer, one of the things we did was go around the state and visit with every town. We went to all 252 towns, and that's where I met Mike actually for the first time in our visit in Poultney way back when. But Proctor. Oh, you were living in Poultney.
Yeah, you're right.
All right. I couldn't remember. But my point is that when we had conversations like that in Proctor and elsewhere, there was a lot of anecdotal stories I was hearing from town clerks about how busy they were. And I sort of would ask them, why are you so busy? And they say, well, we have so many people moving to Vermont. We've had so many land transactions. It's really unusual for us. And I'd ask, can you talk a little bit more about that? What does that mean for you? And they'd say, well, people are moving here from out of state. They generally are moving with kids. They're younger. They're bringing their jobs with them. They're paying for homes in cash above the asking price. And I said, well, that's interesting. And, you know, similar story in Bennington and Windham and Franklin County and certainly in Chittenden County. So when I got into office, I said, well, how can we put data to the anecdotal information I've heard from across the state? And there are a couple of pretty good sources. One was the IRS and another was the Census Bureau. And the Census Bureau shows that, you know, basically we kind of had a volatile period before the pandemic in terms of people moving to Vermont. We kind of were up and down. But then in the years following the pandemic, we had something like 17,500 people migrate into Vermont, which was more in those 2 years than all of the previous 10 years combined. So again, if the trend is to be believed, and I think it is, a significant change in the trajectory in terms of people moving to Vermont. A lot of them moved to Vermont from New England, but others moved from places like Texas and out west, and different kind of migration pattern than we've seen in the past. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But the IRS data gives you some more granularity about people that moved to Vermont. So their data set showed that we've been losing tax filers for the last decade leading up to the pandemic, and that the 2 years following the pandemic, we gained 6,000 combined taxpayers. So it's a little bit different of a number, but the trajectory and the trend is still very similar, that we had this decade of stagnation and then a real change in those 2 years following the pandemic. And when you drill down on the IRS data and said, who are these folks that have moved here? How old are they? What are their demographics? It turned out that about 84% of them, the new tax filers, were between the ages of 24 and 44. So younger people with their whole professional careers ahead of them, likely with children moving to Vermont. And then you looked at their sort of incomes, you know, what kind of incomes were people earning that moved to Vermont? And of those 6,000 or so people, you know, 77% of them were making over $100,000 a year. Over 50% of them were making $200,000 or more a year. So I really said, wow, like this is really from a broad standpoint affirming this anecdotal information I heard, you know, throughout the state about people moving here, them being younger, being wealthier, paying for their homes in cash. But clearly, there are some good things that relate to that. You look at our personal income tax numbers, right? So not that personal income tax had been increased over these 5-year period, but from 2018 to 2023, Personal income tax went from like 850 million to 1.2 billion. So $300 or $400 million more in taxes collected because there are more people in Vermont, there are higher income earners in Vermont. Other reasons explain that as well, but I think that's a significant contributing factor. But we know that when people moved here, they bought a home, they took the house off of the market, and they didn't add a job to the local workforce because they were largely working remotely. So that's the downside of that. That put even more pressure on our housing market as it relates to people trying to find work and trying to get their income from Vermont. There are just less homes for people in Vermont generally, but there are less homes for people that are part of our workforce, for our teachers, for our nurses, for our first responders. It's become even more challenging to live and serve in the same community if that's something that you're desiring to do. So I continue to identify myself, housing as our top economic priority. The trend is good, that story is good. Like we need people to move to Vermont. We need to get younger, we need our workforce to get younger, we need it to get larger, we need to expand our tax base to support our state. But we also need to recognize we're not going to be able to do any of those things unless we expand housing opportunities. And we have to expand those housing opportunities in the right place, like Rutland City, that has a lot of capacity infrastructurally for more housing, that has a lot of the key ingredients, I think, to attract people to want to move and live and stay in Vermont. So we have to do it in a smart way, but we certainly have to continue to put focus on expanding housing opportunities in our state. And just one other thing I'll mention on housing, because I do think it's such a critical issue right now, but it's something I believe we're going to have to keep an eye on over the next decade. It's not going to be something that we solve overnight, and it's not something that's going to relent, I believe, in terms of its pressure. And the reason I say that is because we're still an old state, even though we've had maybe younger people moving into Vermont. Our workforce is still relatively old. 100,000 people in our workforce are over the age of 55. The Department of Labor expects that 88,000 people will retire by 2030. So 2030 is only 6 years away, and the estimate's 88,000 people are going to retire between now and then. We know that when people retire in Vermont, they may leave, but a lot of people stay. And a lot of people may split their time, but they keep their home. So in the same way that people have been moving to Vermont and taking a house off of the market without adding a job to the local workforce, I think we're sort of on the cusp, or maybe we're already starting to experience it, where people are leaving the workforce, but not freeing up their home for a new worker to come in and take their home and join the workforce. So the only way we can sort of get through this period of time to make sure we have the nurses, make sure we have the teachers, and make sure we have the firefighters and the first responders that we need, and all of those critical jobs across our state, is to make sure we build enough housing for them to be able to move and live and be here in an affordable way. So I think that's really our challenge here and now, but I think it's our challenge for the next decade also. And again, it's something we can solve. It's very much in our control. Trying to convince people to move to Vermont, that is a much harder challenge. But I think both because of the post-pandemic period where people have reimagined how they want to live their lives, where they want to live, that flexibility of being able to live and work in different places. I think we're going to see additional pressures wanting people to move to Vermont from a climate change perspective, other parts of the country that are experiencing more impacts from climate change. From a political perspective, people that want more protections and want certain types of policies and certain types of leaders. And I think Vermont, we continue to work really well together, even though we might be from different parties. And that's always been my experience with the Rutland delegation specifically. So I think we're going to continue to be an attractive place for people into the future. And we have to have that opportunity, but we have to respond to that opportunity with more housing. The other thing I want to mention in terms of pre-pandemic and post-pandemic is really this change that's pretty substantial in the amount of capital, the amount of investment capital that's in Vermont and is flowing into Vermont. So we have some really great examples of businesses in our state that are doing quite well. Beta Technologies, one up in the Burlington area that's raised a lot of money from in and out of state individuals. Hula, which is up in Burlington, they've also created a fund that helps invest in a lot of smaller businesses throughout the region. A lot of them have been having success. And when you add that all up and look at, again, at the data across the state, Vermont, it's really the metro area of Burlington, so it's Burlington, Franklin County, Addison County. I think it even comes down a little bit in the Rutland County. But they call it a partial economic area. And in that partial economic area of Vermont, we had $550 million of venture capital money come into the state in 2022. And that was pretty similar to 2021 as well. They're 2 big years following the pandemic. And that's not to suggest that that trend was like that in the years before the pandemic. Vermont, in fact, had something like a 400% increase post-pandemic from pre-pandemic in terms of venture capital money coming into our state. And we were #1 in the country in terms of the most significant increase, the most significant change in terms of venture capital money being invested in our state. So again, we have another real opportunity there. You look at our corporate income tax returns, and those similarly have been going up over the last 5 years in a pretty dramatic way, from $100+ million up to $270 million. So another good story in terms of more capital, more businesses being in Vermont. And when you ask those companies, why are you here? What are you excited about Vermont? They cite for themselves the desire to live in a place where they have community. They desire to live in a place with outdoor recreational opportunities that are nearby and very accessible. And they talk about how their employees want those same exact things, and that's why they're in Vermont, and that's why they're not leaving Vermont. So even though we need to build more housing, we need to also balance that with preserving our outdoor recreation, our natural beauty, all of those things that make Vermont special. I don't see those things in competition with each other. I actually see them as both necessary to build the kind of strong economic future and a strong societal future we want in our state. So I think that is really important and critical. So from an economic standpoint, I think we have a vision over the next decade that we could execute on, largely around the need for more housing in our communities. And I think if we do that, then we have a real opportunity to be successful over the next 10, 20 years and beyond. A couple of things I just wanted to hit on relating to our office. So in that vein, with housing being the #1 issue, we took a good hard look at the levers that we had to pull within the Treasurer's office and landed on this 10% in Vermont program. So this program allows the Treasurer to invest up to 10% of the state's cash on hand in economic development and job creation. And historically, maybe the state of Vermont had $200 or $300 million cash on hand. So this is money that's come into the state. It's been appropriated, but it's not yet been spent, or it's come into the state and it's not yet been appropriated by the legislature. So it's kind of this, money like that would be in your checking account. It's money that's come in. Maybe you're going to spend it, or you have a plan to spend it, but you haven't yet spent it. So it's sort of in this sort of, transition period. And that $200 to $300 million of cash on hand since the pandemic has grown to $2 billion+ cash on hand with regularity. A lot of that is federal money that we're holding, that we're waiting to spend down. But a lot of it is also just new revenue from the state of Vermont. Our budgets have grown bigger. Our revenues, as I mentioned, have grown bigger. We have more cash on hand. We have more money waiting to be spent. And we decided that we could significantly expand this 10% in Vermont program, expand it by close to $85 million, and that we would focus it on housing specifically. How do we build more housing? Affordable housing with a capital A, but also workforce housing and what you might call missing middle housing as well. And we decided to do something else with the program. We said, we really want our program to be counter-cyclical. So interest rate environment is really high right now. The interest rate environment is really making it a challenge for businesses and for developers to finish projects that had started before the pandemic or were penciled out before the pandemic. Things have gotten so much more expensive. When they try to close those gaps that have grown in expense with today's commercial rates, all of a sudden the whole thing starts not to work so well, or maybe not at all. So we really viewed this 10% in Vermont program as an opportunity to cut against the high interest rates, and we offered the money at really low rates. 1% if it was 5 years or less, 1.5% if it was 5 to 10 years, 2% if it was between 10 and 20 years. And we've been able to find really good partners to lend that money out to support. At this point, we're estimating about 1,100 units of new housing throughout Vermont. Again, affordable housing, but a lot of market rate housing as well, and we wanted to try to find that balance. We have been in conversation with the city of Rutland and are looking forward to executing on potentially a few opportunities here as well. I think there are a lot of key ingredients in the Rutland area and Rutland City in particular when you think about, again, that infrastructure to grow, when you think about big employers that are based here, that are sort of the core of your economy. Not all regions have that. Castleton just down the road, a really strong hospital system. There are a lot of really good ingredients to want to invest in this area, and I think from a broad economic standpoint, it's great to have Chittenden County doing well, and we want it to do well, but we need other parts of the state to be doing as well also. We want there to be a second economic engine in our state, and I think that the city of Rutland has that real potential and real opportunity to be that second economic engine. So we have some more projects that we'll announce in 2024, but we've been really excited about that program. And again, from our perspective, nothing can create jobs more effectively right now in our state than adding more housing so businesses can expand, workforce will expand, and there's more revenue coming into the state and more economic opportunity for people. The other thing that we focused on, which Lyle mentioned, was this Vermont Saves program. And I do want to thank the legislators who are here because Vermont Saves passed unanimously, so I know they all voted for it. So thank you. Thank you for your support. And what really was a great collaboration with the legislature to get this passed. But as Lyle mentioned, there's a lot of small businesses in our state that just can't afford to offer a 401k plan or other types of retirement plans. It's not that they don't want to, it's that it can be really expensive and it can be administratively burdensome. But at the same time, those 88,000 to 100,000 Vermonters that don't have access to retirement through their workplace, we know that they're not saving for retirement. And we know that because the data will show that if you don't have access to a workplace retirement plan, and like 95% of people are not saving a penny for retirement. That's the vehicle in today's day and age to save and to build for your future. We certainly don't have private pensions. Public pensions are still there, but those aren't necessarily, a large swath of our population have access to them. So we need to make sure that there is at least access to something that is low cost and easy and affordable. And that's what Vermont Saves does and will do. We're in the process of setting it up right now. So we've hired an executive director. We're looking to partner with another state that is a couple of years ahead of us in this process, and we hope to announce that state partnership in the next month or so. But that state partnership will let us set the program up even more quickly. It'll bring down costs over the long term because we won't just be relying on Vermont workers, but it will be workers across the contract, which will potentially have many states added to it over the years. So by the end of the year, we hope that Vermont Saves will be stood up maybe at the beginning of 2025. And what it will require is that businesses that don't offer a workplace retirement plan, it will require them to sign up for Vermont Saves. There's no cost to the business. This is a requirement that you sign up. By signing up, your employees will be automatically enrolled unless they opt out of the program, which they can do at the beginning or they can do at any time. And then 5% payroll deduction will kick in at that point if they don't opt out, and will be put automatically into a Roth IRA. And they can increase that contribution amount up to 8%, up to 10%. They can decrease it down to 2%, down to 1%. Again, they can always opt out as well. But what we're trying to do is create this very easy avenue to start saving for your future. And by doing that, you obviously build financial security for those individuals and their families. You make sure that they have more discretionary income as they enter retirement, and I view that will be a good thing for the economy as well. And then the other hope is that they become less dependent on state benefits and state requirements and federal requirements because they have more security themselves in their retirement. So hopefully it'll put pressure off of the budget in the long term as well. It's also a Roth IRA, so you always have access to your money. You have access to the principal that you put in. That was another feature for us that was important. So if you're a worker who is part of a business that's required to sign up for Vermont Saves, and you ignore all the emails, you ignore the letters, and then you look at your paycheck and you say, I don't understand what that 5% is, but I'm going to ignore it. And then 6 months later, you say, what is this thing anyway? And it ends up that you have $750 in there, and you say, boy, like, my car just broke down. I need $500 to fix my car. You can go in and take that money. It serves as a emergency savings account as a secondary factor, but we obviously want people to keep their money in and have it continue to grow for them. But we thought a really important feature of this program was the ability to access money in an emergency or for whatever reason, that you always have access to it without penalty or tax implications. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, which is something that's actively working on in the legislature, is a proposal that we put forward called baby bonds. And it's an interesting proposal, and we are really excited about it. Again, it's a long-term kind of proposal, long-term kind of thinking, but baby bonds is a concept that says we should be investing in people and investing in those communities that people live in. And what it would do is set aside a certain amount of money. What the proposal would be is $3,200 for children born on Medicaid. So the most impoverished families and the most impoverished babies in Vermont. It would set aside $3,200. The Treasurer's Office would invest that money over time. Between the ages of 18 and 30, those babies that are now young adults could claim their baby bond for the purposes of buying a home in Vermont, starting a business or investing in a business in Vermont, going to higher education or job training, or rolling it over into their retirement. So similarly to Vermont Saves, we really view this as a long-term anti-poverty measure. We view it as a relatively small investment. It's estimated to cost about $6 million, but by the time that $6 million is making an impact for those individuals, it will grow to $20, $22, $23, $24, $25 million. So it'll be making an outsized impact by the time it's actually deployed. It'll be making those individuals much more self-sufficient, much more opportunity and excitement about their future, and it will be trying to retain them here in Vermont, which again is one of our important things that we need to be thinking about long term. How do we retain young people in Vermont, and how do we make it affordable for them to live here? And then the last thing it's focused on is rural economic development. There are more children born on Medicaid in terms of a proportion of births in the more rural areas like southern Vermont and the Northeast Kingdom than there are in the Montpelier or Burlington areas. So it disproportionately benefits rural parts of Vermont as well. So we've created a funding stream from our unclaimed property division. That's our proposal. It doesn't have any budgetary impact. We're working with the legislature to try to get that proposal through and get it funded, but we think it would have a really big long-term impact with a relatively small investment in the most impoverished children in our state. So those are the things that we're working on and have worked on, and Lyle, I'll be happy to take any questions that folks might have.
So my first question is, do baby bonds follow the baby?
Do baby bonds follow the baby?
Do they have to stay in Vermont?
They will have to stay in Vermont. It's an anti-poverty tool, it's a rural economic development tool, but it's also a retention of young people tool. They have to be a Vermont resident when they claim their baby bond. And most of the activities, and we're trying to figure out ways to make all of them more tied to Vermont. So when you get your baby bond, you don't just cash it out and leave. You have to invest it into Vermont and into your future.
Great. A question about the piece that I read about your bio. You talked about Jay Peak. What did you learn from Jay Peak and that experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. Wow. So I started in state government in February of 2014. So it was about 10 years ago. And within 6 months, the governor at the time had asked our department to oversee the program. And we didn't quite know what that meant, but it took us about another 6 months to enter into an agreement with ACCD to sort of figure out how we were going to split the responsibilities. And then in our first meeting with the developers, there were some red flags that we picked up on, and we can get into that in another date. But and then we set off on this 13-month investigation with the SEC and with the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office to uncover everything that had happened at Jay Peak. And, we wrote a report that looked at sort of what were the big takeaways structurally from that. And one of them was, making sure there were good separation of duties. You have a economic supporter, economic promotion agency. Make sure that they also are not the regulator, that there's sort of a separate entity that can do the regulation. When you have a program like that and you are a regulator, you have to make sure there are the appropriate amount of resources and expertise so that they can actually do their job. And then there has to be the appropriate amount of authority as well, so that they can issue subpoenas, that can force testimony, that can force records being turned over. Because all of those things weren't in place for the time period leading up to JP. So there definitely were structurally things that we all have learned in state government that we won't hopefully repeat when we're setting up a new program.
Great. And in all Super Bowls, there is a brief commercial message. And as I'm looking at the sign over your shoulder, Omnia is here, and they are a major sponsor of this event every year. And we would like to thank them. This is the Omnia table up here. Thank you very much for sponsoring this event. And also, what would we do without PEG TV? Now you can hear me, and they are back here, and they're recording this, so that's why I'm taking your questions. No one will know what you asked on the question here.
Oh,
let's thank PEG TV for being here. Thank you, PEG TV. Financial question here. The state's credit rating was downgraded 5 or so years ago, which caused borrowing costs to increase for the state and municipalities. Are we at risk of another downgrade? How do we avoid that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's true we were AAA, and then we got downgraded to AA+, and we still have the highest rating in New England, but we were downgraded for 2 reasons. One we've talked about already, the demographics. Right, the rating agency said your state is getting smaller, your workforce is getting smaller. Even if you have the same amount of debt outstanding, you're going to have less taxpayers and less revenue coming into the state to pay that tax. You're becoming a bigger risk in terms of paying it back. So demographics was one, and the other one was the pension system for the state, primarily the teachers and the state employees' pension system. So what has changed since the downgrade? Our demographics have improved, as we talked about, and we had the rating agencies up in August and had an in-person meeting with them. We invited them up, and we had a whole day of tours and discussion throughout Vermont, mostly Chittenden County, just for time's sake. And they were really impressed with what was going on in our state, and they recognized that in their most recent report, saying they saw some changes in demographics and they wanted to see those changes continue. On the pension side, we did have a pension reform bill about 2.5 years ago that made changes to the system. It required more money going into the system from individuals paying in. Like myself, it required the state of Vermont to contribute more money. It reduced some benefits, but it was an agreement that was agreed to by the legislature, by the other stakeholders within the union. I was on the pension reform task force, and I voted for it as well. And for the last 3 years, although our pensions had been going down like this in terms of the funding ratio, so all the money we need today to pay for all the expenses over time, that funding ratio had been trending down, and now for the last 3 years, it's starting to tick up. And Peter Fagan was on that pension reform task force as well, and he was a great leader on that, and the results are getting better. The teachers were sort of in this 50% funded ratio, which was really scary. Now they're closer to 60%, so they're trending up. State of Vermont is close to 70%, so it's trending up. So the rating agencies recognize that as well in their report and said if that continues, that's going to be viewed very favorably to them. And then the third thing that they cited, although they didn't cite it during the downgrade, was just the overall amount of debt separate from the pension that's outstanding, all the bonds. And that's been going down over time as well. So they cited that improved demographics, better funding on the pensions, and reduced debt burden as 3 things that, in my opinion, we can continue to see over the next 2 to 3 years. We're talking about an upgrade, not another downgrade.
There'll be several people in our communities that feel that the Rutland region has done its fair share in helping vulnerable folks during the pandemic with the hotel issues and trying to help people through the process. Some feel that maybe we did more than our fair share during that period of time. But as we recover from that, how do we make sure that the most vulnerable Vermonters aren't left behind as we grow and prosper?
Yeah, so just to your first point, Lyle, because as I mentioned, I grew up in Brattleboro, and I think Brattleboro feels the same way that Rutland does in terms of carrying some of the load of during the pandemic and the post-pandemic sort of period of transition and economic upheaval and the increase in people experiencing homelessness. And Brattleboro described it quite well. They said, we're a town of 12,000 people, but we are dealing with a homelessness issue as if we're a town of 40,000 people, but we only have the resources of a town of 12,000 people. And I think probably Rutland feels the same way, and I guess that would really speak to the need for the state of Vermont to provide more support to those kind of communities to make sure that they have the resources they need to deal with that problem as if they're a much larger community. I think going forward, how do we make sure they're not left behind? It comes back to the thing I talked the most about today, which is housing. When we looked at homelessness specifically and why are we seeing an increase in homelessness in Vermont, you can cite a whole bunch of reasons, but I think it's really quite clear and quite simple. We had a professor who wrote a book called Homelessness is a Housing Problem. He did a webinar in July with our office, and he said he looked at all the various reasons that you could have increased homelessness between different cities, whether you had better benefits, so that was attracting individuals, whether you had better weather, which might be attracting individuals, whether you were a poorer community, and all of those things didn't correlate. There was no correlation between the city and increased homelessness. The only thing that he found that correlated was the median rent and the vacancy rate. So the higher the rents, the lower the vacancy rate, the less opportunities there are for people to be housed and to be housed affordably. And that held steady. And then the other variable that was important was that there were places that did see population increase, but that they did not see their homelessness numbers increase. And the reason that didn't happen was because they had housing elasticity. When their population went up, their housing stock grew with their population, and homelessness stayed flat. Those cities that grew and had an inelastic, like I would suggest in Vermont, we had an inelastic housing stock. We haven't really grown it significantly in recent years. When our population went up, our housing stock stayed the same, and all those vulnerable people that were on the edges and really challenged in a day-to-day, in their day-to-day lives, ended up without a home, ended up on the street, and it really gets tied back to making housing available to individuals. There are other things as well, but I think housing is the first and most critical.
This is not really a question, but if anyone has a question about, and this is the first time I've heard about this, Tom, the poll attachment fee bill, see Tom, and I'm sure it has implications with PEG TV and what will happen with their funding. I don't know if you know anything about it.
Yeah, well, I think it gets into there used to be a lot more funding that went to community television through cable subscriptions and things of that nature, and more and more people are moving away from cable subscriptions and getting YouTube or getting Netflix or getting Hula and all the like, and that's impacted revenues on the community television. And when you think about what's happening in journalism more broadly, like we're losing a lot of local papers or local papers that still exist. They don't have the same robust coverage that they once did. I think of the Burlington Free Press as having a much more limited opportunity to cover all of the comings and goings of local government. So it often falls to public TV to cover our select board meetings and our town meetings, and without that, the amount of transparency that would exist in government would be almost nothing. And so I think it's critical not just to the organizations, but those organizations are critical to our local democracies to keep all of us accountable.
And if there's a brave soul out there,
that's why we're there today.
If there's a brave soul out there that did not write a question, Mr. Hack, is it a short question? You know I love you. Go.
Stay in Vermont, which I think is great. The real question is, when will the education funds and school choice thing?
Well, that's been something that. So, are you talking about for higher education?
9 through 12 school choice towns.
Yeah.
The state of Vermont sends money out of the country for students to go to.
Yeah.
To Florida also, Connecticut. It's a public education fund. It should stay in Vermont.
Yeah, so we've been discussing that issue with baby bonds, not necessarily for 700K, but from, higher education more broadly, because there's a similar argument about why do we send state funds to support higher education to students that go to schools outside of Vermont, and that's something that we've been wrestling with, and Representative Jerome has been asking us a lot of tough questions in that regard as well, which is good. But at least as it relates to higher education and the way we structured baby bonds, we did allow for the option for individuals to go outside of Vermont. And the reason we did that was because, looking at the data, most higher education students in Vermont will end up staying at UVM or at the state colleges. And then those that don't, there might be a very particular reason for higher education that they want to go to they want to go to Smith College, an all-women college, or they want to go to a historically black college, or they get into Harvard, or they get into Yale, and they have these unique opportunities. So at least with baby bonds, we determined that we didn't want to put up a barrier to people to pursue those unique opportunities. With our K through 12 system, it's something we need to support our public education system. In my perspective, we need to try to keep dollars in Vermont and bring dollars into Vermont. Now, there could be families that have a very unique situation where they have a school for individuals that have dyslexia or have some other learning disability. So I think we need to be thoughtful about our approach to it. But generally, as a policy matter, I want policies that keep our money in Vermont and bring money from outside of Vermont into Vermont and make us a wealthier state.
So Mike, I was on the school board for 15 years also. Last year was the first year I didn't run.
Wow.
I am talking about 7 through 12, and for certain families that may send their kids to a ski school or a hockey school or something like that. KUA, we're sending money over there. Just alone in the Woodstock district, that Torrington belongs to, we're probably sending 12 over there. The funny thing is, you mentioned Smith College. I have 3 daughters that are all Smithies. And when my first daughter went to apply for colleges, she's 26 now. Even though Smith College is like a $70-something thousand school back then, she was also accepted into UVM. It was pretty sad to see that UVM was going to cost more than Smith College.
Yeah, we had somebody working for us through the pandemic, and he ended up he grew up in Vermont and he went to Harvard, and he told me that his package at Harvard was more competitive financially than UVM's, and it's a challenge.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, and Mike, we want to thank you
Thanks a
for
lot.
being here. I would like to say that we've loved our state treasurers over time. You have spent a lot of time in the last year in Rutland County, and we very much appreciate that, and we look forward to you coming back every time. And if you want to bring bags of money with you when you come, that's even better. Ladies and gentlemen, Mike Pieciak, state treasurer. We have some brief comments from our legislators here. And Butch, I don't know who you would like to have go first.
So we're going to mix up our presentation a little bit because we have a couple of legislators that need to leave in a little bit. So Stephanie, I will ask you to
Ladies and gentlemen, Stephanie Jerome, representative from Brandon.
So I'm Stephanie Jerome. It's always tough to follow Mike Pieciak, but I'm happy to do it. I work closely with Mike in the House Commerce Committee. So I'm the vice chair of the Commerce and Economic Development Committee. It's a unique committee, and that's the only committee in the House that's chaired by a Republican. So I'm the lead Democrat in that committee. And I guess I say that because I just want to let you know that it's a very fair and balanced committee, and we're working towards the best interest for the policies of workforce development and business in the state. I'm also, I heard mention of the UVM. I'm also the legislative appointee to the University of Vermont Board of Trustees, and just recently have been appointed to the Vermont Economic Progress Council, which is somewhat related to the TIF districts in the region. So over the past few years, I've spoken, I think last year I spoke a little bit about our workforce development work that we had done in the State House, and tremendous progress was done over the past 3 years in funding scholarships and grants and loans and forgivable loans in healthcare, career technical education, the arts and small business assistance, amongst other areas. And we're seeing these efforts come into effect now. It's taken a little bit longer than I would have liked to have seen these programs sort of kick off, but recently we saw that the really interest in healthcare in the region, and there's a bump up for nursing faculty salaries that's just gone into effect a couple of years to get that bill moving to actual get into work. And then the other one locally for healthcare is a bump up in salary or per hour wage for nurses who help train student nurses in the hospitals. So really happy to try to just increase that much needed sector of our economy locally. Did a lot of work with career technical education, adult CTE, but I look at the work that we have done in the state, and our regionally, and Stafford Tech is one of the best programs in the state, but that is at capacity, and I would love to see each one of our students who graduate from high school in Rutland County, regardless if they're going to college or the military, but everyone, it would be really, really wonderful to see every student graduate with a certificate or a credential to go into the workforce. So this year, we were working on a really wide variety of bills, but both mostly focusing on, so far, focusing on economic development and consumer protection. So let's just go over a couple of the two major bills that I'm working on. One that has probably the biggest impact locally is H666. And although this is an ominous numbered bill, it is definitely will have a positive impact in our region. The bill makes it possible, it's a little bit technical, but the bill makes it possible for a developer to use deposits put on a residential unit by the future purchaser. It's used in that deposit will be used in the actual building project instead of staying in the individual escrow account. So this would allow construction firms to use deposits for building projects as long as they are backed 100% by a surety bond. So, for example, if a developer wanted to withdraw $50,000 in deposits for construction costs, the developer would then need to get a $50,000 surety bond. The idea is to maintain protections for it would maintain the protections for the future resident while also granting developers increased financial flexibility. This will be used, most likely be used in new developments at the base of Killington, and then also would help other large construction projects. It provides another method of financing for residential building projects, more flexibility, and certainly more flexibility in our housing sector. So that was the one. The second bill is that I'm working on is H121, and that's a data privacy bill. So data privacy legislation is a consumer protection. It's not political, and it absolutely cuts across party lines. Protecting our personal information, our face, our fingerprints, our gait, our shopping habits, our travel, our running routes. This is our biometric and our personal data, and it belongs to us. Is it the right that data brokers can sell information that belongs to me without my knowledge? How much data can be sold and used? What kind of permissions do I give? And how can I opt out of providing this information? And who benefits, and what are the safeguards? 14 states have passed data privacy legislation to protect consumer privacy, our personal identification, and probably most importantly, our children's data. Another 10 states, including Vermont, are currently working on data privacy bills. So nationally, this is a really important topic, and by all rights should really be a federal legislation, but it's not happening, and the states are having to take responsibility. In the Commerce Committee, we are working on we're working on this bill and working on the already passed legislation around the country, really heavily basing our bill on the state of Connecticut and also using pieces of California's and Washington and Oregon's work that they've done to date. We're looking to make a bill that's right-sized for Vermonters and for Vermont businesses, and one that meshes well with all the other states in our region, so it makes doing business in Vermont easier, because we're looking at sort of this regional work with other states. So that sort of sums up couple of the big major things that we're doing. But I wanted to bring H666 to your attention because of the benefit that it will have to the Rutland County, and also H121, because I think that's a consumer protection, not only for our personal data, but also working with our local businesses as well. So thank you.
Stephanie, thank you very much. And next up will be Pieciak, which is our delegation chair and represents Pittsburgh. And before you go on, I'm glad you mentioned the protection of data, because I went on to ChatGTP last night thinking if there weren't enough questions for the state treasurer, would ChatGTP suggest some 100 questions within about 3 seconds. I didn't ask any of them. They were all really good. So we're going to turn it now over to Butch. Thank you, Stephanie.
Good morning. Butch Shaw. I do represent Pittsburgh and Proctor. And well, that's important, Glenn. Okay, thank you. And I serve on the House Transportation Committee as the vice chair. But I'm not going to talk transportation this morning. I'm going to try to talk a number, which I really hate to do with the treasurer sitting in the office. But I will. The buzz about the building in the last 2 weeks or a little bit longer has been the $243-point-something million hole in the education fund. That's a serious problem for all of us as taxpayers. We've heard in December the governor's required report that property taxes could be going up around 20% in Vermont. I didn't personally think much about that because we've always been able to figure out a way to buy that down. But then it raised its ugly head again. Last session, the House and Senate passed Act 127, which was a correction to the equalized education funding as required by the Brigham decision that was made several years ago after Act 60 and 61 passed. So we made the legislature, in our infinite wisdom, made a correction to allow school boards and your local boards and everybody to get some better equalized value for some weighted students, and that's another whole conversation. But what we did actually allowed and encouraged districts to spend up in this year's and their local school budgets this year. They spend up to a cap. If they don't go over the cap, there's no penalty. And in the future years, the intent was to have that go down. However, that's not happening. This year, the education agency has reported about a $243.4 million increase in statewide education spending. $65 to $70 million is an average year. So we're in a pickle. So the House, along with the Senate and the administration, is working to come up with some sort of solution. Two things enter into this. There are non-property taxes that go into the ed fund. As a matter of fact, part of the purchase and use tax you pay goes into the ed fund. They're projected to grow this year by only about $20 million. Still leaves us a long way to go. So this means that the balance has to be paid through the property tax. There's no way around that. So what this bill will do with some modifications, and it's reasonably technical, I won't go into that, I want to stay at a pretty high level. The school boards can pull back. This will allow school boards to pull their budgets back in, reassess their budget, hopefully reducing the extra spending that was included in their budget this year, and therefore reducing the pressure on the ed fund spending. This bill would allow the school boards to do this. Most school boards have probably already published or ready to publish their budget for their annual meetings and vote on town meeting day. But this bill would allow them to pull that budget back, even if it's been voted on, and even if their absentee ballots have been voted on, they'll be able to pull those back, readjust their budget, resubmit it to AOE with some awards based on percentage spending. And then we'll take a look and see where we are on there. But just remember, anything over that we can't handle, that we don't have the funds to fill the holes. Sometimes we use one-time money, sometimes we use some reserves to fill the hole, that previously $60, $70 million hole. And so we'll use those, but we'll try to buy down this budget. So it's important to know that, yes, your local school boards and union districts can bring their budget back in, review it, put it back out, rewarn it, and go from there and see how we do. The bill, when it has a number, we don't have a number yet because it hasn't left the House. It has a number. Going once, 850, H850, thank you, Bill. Bill Campbell's here, he serves on Ways and Means. He has the nuts and bolts down. And he's promised me he would stay here if anybody has any questions when we're done today. Yeah, until noon, he needs to. You heard the bus just come through, so Bill, you're under the bus, so thank you for that. And as a matter of fact, we all will hang around afterward if you have any further questions. But with that, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that's what we're up against right now. And it really struck me yesterday. I was walking into church yesterday morning, and I had an elderly lady come to me and say, "Are my property taxes going up 20%? And I had to say, could be, but we're working on it. So we'll see where we land, and we'll move forward and move on. And with that, I would like to yield to the golden voice of radio and the Senate, Senator Brian Hall.
Thank you, Bill. So good morning. And if there's one thing that I hope you take away from today, it's this. The cupboard is bare, the pantry is empty. I say that because according to the state auditor, Vermont received about $10.9 billion between the CARES Act and ARPA. This includes individual Vermonters, institutions, as well as the state itself. It also includes $2.25 billion, which was distributed by the state legislature to various programs to assist Vermont residents and businesses. Those funds are gone, either by appropriation or being obligated. And while it will be tempting for a lot of us to want to fund additional programs this year, many of which are excellent ideas, there are only two ways to do that, since there's nothing left in the pantry. You either cut a program which is already in existence, or you increase taxes or fees. Most Vermonters are just beginning to feel the effects of a new payroll tax which went into effect last year to fund childcare. And I've already heard from a lot of people who weren't aware of the DMV fee increases of about 20%. So when you go to renew your car registration or your license, all of a sudden we get a lot of calls, what's this all about? So people are beginning to feel the effects of that. And obviously, as Bush just mentioned, there's a tremendous concern about the property taxes in terms of funding education. So hopefully we'll come up with an answer. We don't know where it's going to be yet. My guess is that most districts will have an increase, but I don't think very, very, very few of them will be 20%. It might be in the single numbers and more sort of a normal year, if you will. So the Senate on Friday passed its version of the so-called Budget Adjustment Act, which I'll refer to as the BAA. It clawed back about half of what came over from the House, and it's still millions of dollars more than what the governor proposed in his budget. Governor proposed an $8.6 billion budget for FY25, and as he has done before, he urged lawmakers not to raise taxes or fees to pay for that. The revised Senate version of the BAA will most likely head for a committee of conference this coming week. And one of the Senate's provisions will continue to fund the hotel motel voucher program beyond April 1st. Right now it's scheduled to end on April 1st. But it does limit those hotel vouchers to families with children, pregnant people, people over 65, and people with disabilities through June 30th. That'll be the new date if this goes into effect. And the state would spend $80 a night on a hotel room and not the $130 or so that they're getting now. Senate earlier this year voted to sustain the veto on what would have been the expansion of the bottle bill. S-160 was the first bill signed into law in this session. Governor signed it on February 7th. It will reimburse a municipality for certain state education property tax payments if the municipality granted tax abatements to property owners for damage caused by flooding. And obviously, that's a big issue as well. So we've got housing to deal with, and we've got the flooding damage to deal with. And the Senate also passed and sent on to the House a bill which would allow the state treasurer to invest state funds, including certificates of deposit, at banks, credit unions, as defined in Title VIII, and then savings and loan associations approved by the treasurer. And I mentioned the issue of housing continues to be worked on in both chambers. Nothing has come to the floor yet in that regard yet this year, but we all realize what an important issue it is. So that's all I got, and thank you all for coming. Well, I got back to you.
And I think we all recognize the access that we have to our local legislators, to our local administrators in towns and villages. Vermont is a special place. Let's thank our legislators and our guests, Mike Pieciak, again for coming. Thank you very much. And I'd also like to have us once again thank Omnia and PEG TV for their support. Omnia and PEG TV, thank you very much. And I would be remiss if I didn't invite you tomorrow night. We have a mixer at Rutland County Pride on West Street. If you'd like to come to that from 5 to 7, Rutland County Pride on West Street. Also, we have the Business Feud coming up on Saturday, the 24th. There are many businesses within this room that will be participating and competing there. And Vista Senior Living has a mixer on March 12th. We invite you to Mendon and Killington. I think you own a little in Mendon and a little in Killington there. And the business show comes up on April 9th. We'll be at Rutland Rec. I want to thank you all for being here. Our legislators are here. Ask them questions. Thank you for coming. Keep working on our economy. Thank you.